There will be a giant serpent of hellfire that needs to be defeated in the final war, just as was stated in the Harley. And we already know that Loki the dragon is the one who is destined to defeat this serpent. And we even know what the serpent is almost guaranteed to be. The giants of Elbaf have told us their enemy, the serpent soaked in blood, aka a red serpent, is literally the red line. This has been what One Piece has been leading to, just as Ragnarok, the final war in Norse mythology, begins when the great serpent that circles the globe awakens and begins to rampage, so too will the One Piece final war feature the awakening of the great serpent that wraps around the globe and the beginning of its rampage. But what readers don't realize is that the serpent is destined to be freed by none other than Blackbeard, because Blackbeard's plan all along was to get the Gura Gura no Mi, precisely because the earthquake fruit is the one thing that can destroy the red line. That is why this fruit is said to be able to end the world, as it is the one key to releasing the serpent from inside the red line and unleashing hell on earth yet again. If that sounds like a lot to take in, then strap in, because in today's mega theory, we're going to be breaking down a gigantic new addition to the final war that just became clear, starting with how the Harley text already spells out that it will be Blackbeard who cracks open the red line to unleash the serpent of hellfire, how the Skypiea arc foreshadows exactly what this serpent's role will be in the final war, and how the trifecta of Emu, Blackbeard, and the serpent actually completes the full picture of One Piece's overarching thematic conflict that must be resolved in the final war. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, you can become your favorite admiral with the first ever Logia hoodies, the Magma hoodie, the Ice hoodie, and the Light hoodie. And the best part is, for the official launch of the Logia line, this month, all hoodies are $80 off. And on top of that, if you buy 2 hoodies, you get the third one free. These are 100% cotton, multicolored jacquard hoodies made to order with patterns literally knitted directly into the fabric. And right over the heart, you have the embroidered devil fruit detail. All hoodies are made to order and will take some time to ship. So go get your hoodies right now while they're $80 off, and you can buy 2, get 1 free before the deal runs out. Just hit the link in the description below. So that aside, to begin with, at this point it is near guaranteed that Loki is the dragon in the mural. You can watch this video breaking down why that is practically certain to be the case, which calls into question what exactly is the giant serpent on the right side then, aka the serpent of hellfire that is talked about in the first world of the Harley. Well, this serpent is almost definitely the red line itself. From the beginning of the story all the way back in Elbaf, the giant story in Brogy reference how the blood-soaked serpent is the only thing that they fear, and it is confirmed that Dory and Brogy are referring to the red line here by Harold and Ida's conversation, where it is explicitly established that the blood-soaked serpent is the giant's way of referring to the red line. So the red line is viewed as a serpent in giant mythology, and they view it as the one thing they cannot defeat. And considering it would be really strange if the giants viewed a giant rock wall as an enemy that they cannot defeat, it would make a lot more sense if the red line actually literally is a dormant serpent from ancient times, the greatest enemy of the Elbaf giants, and that is precisely why the mural portrays the dragon Loki, the guardian of Elbaf, battling against a gigantic serpent. If we now know that the dragon in the mural is real and a major part of the final war, then naturally so too will the serpent be real, and it's basically already been spelled out for us by the giants themselves that the red line is the serpent. This also makes perfect sense when you consider how Oda tends to plant the seeds for the finale of the story. We've always been building towards overthrowing the world government since the beginning of the series. We've always been building towards Blackbeard as the ultimate pirate villain since the beginning of the series. So for Oda to randomly add in a giant world-eating snake that must be defeated out of the blue would not be Oda's typical style of writing. What would make a lot more sense is if the serpent that is now being revealed is actually something that Oda had already been hinting at and planting the seeds for from the beginning of the series. And it's true that from the beginning we were told about a great evil serpent, the Red Line. And what's additionally interesting is that this picture of the final war that's being painted, of having to fight not only the evil god Emu and his subordinates, but also this giant serpent, fits exactly what was foreshadowed in the Skypiea arc. In Skypiea, even though the main conflict was a rebellion against Enel and his priests, throughout the arc there was also another major problem, this gigantic snake Nola. This snake was not Enel's subordinate, it did not belong to anyone, it was simply a force of nature, an unbridled, destructive force that rampaged through the island throughout the Skypiea war. It was an enemy to both Enel's soldiers and the Shandians alike, and it was actually absurdly strong by the standards of that arc. Literally, no one could defeat this monstrous enraged snake. Not Luffy, not Zoro, not Wiper. Hell, Luffy is literally eaten by the snake and spends most of the second act of Skypiea trapped inside it. Enel is the strongest villain in Skypiea, of course, but no joke, no exaggeration, the rampaging snake was the second strongest being on the island. And just like the rest of the Skypiea arc in general tells us so much about the future of the story and the final war of One Piece, I believe the snake's role in Skypiea is strong foreshadowing for what we will see in the final war as well, with the mural also reinforcing that as a preview for what's to come. In the final war, the protagonists will have to deal with a gigantic, chaotic, unstoppable serpent rampaging through the battle, just as in Skypiea. And a really interesting point about that is the fact that the serpent in the Skypiea arc was an agent of chaos for that storyline, which brings us to One Piece's #1 agent of chaos, Blackbeard. So the biggest question regarding the Red Line awakening as a serpent is how would this even happen? Is the serpent literally made out of rock and it will simply get up and start moving? Or was the serpent once not made out of rock and was turned into rock? Or finally, is the Red Line itself not literally the serpent, but rather the serpent is trapped within the Red Line, simply covered by the rock, much like the Titans in the walls of Attack on Titan? I believe that all signs right now point to the third option. The serpent is lying dormant within the Red Line, covered by rock, with the setup being that Blackbeard will use the Gura Gura no Mi to free it. Now before we break this down, it should be quickly acknowledged that a lot of people feel that option 2 is actually the answer, and that the snake was turned to stone thanks to Boa Hancock's fruit in the past, the Mero Mero no Mi, and that's why Blackbeard wanted the fruit from Boa Hancock. However, there are several issues with this. First, Hancock's fruit only turns its targets into stone. It does not cover them in stone, meaning the targets become statues that retain their original form and figure. And the problem is, the Red Line does not literally look like a snake. If it was a snake that had been turned to stone, it would be curved on the sides. It would essentially be one very long cylinder. But the Red Line is clearly a long wall with straight sides. And beyond that, the reverse mountain's existence basically straight up disproves the statue theory. The general physical shape of the Red Line also explains why option 1 doesn't make sense either. Based on physical appearances, it makes far more sense that the serpent is lying dormant within the Red Line, covered in rock. Even setting the physical shape of the Red Line aside, the bigger problem is that it's already been established that once the user of the Mero Mero no Mi dies, the next user cannot unpetrify a previous user's statues. That would mean that if the serpent was turned to stone by a Mero Mero no Mi user in the first world, then now it cannot be turned back since that original user no longer exists. Boa Hancock is the one with the fruit now. And finally, even if you believe that Hancock was lying to Blackbeard here, then you would still expect Blackbeard to have a much more shocked reaction to hearing this news, that the petrification can't be undone, since that would mean that his entire plan to free the snake was just ruined, and Blackbeard does seem to legitimately believe what Boa Hancock is saying. So while the Red Line is not just the serpent turned to stone by the Mero Mero no Mi, I do believe that Hancock and the Mero Mero no Mi do actually play into the Red Line serpent lore, just not in the way that people think. It's too long of a tangent to explain here, so I break it down in my weekly podcast that just dropped, but a little clue I'll drop here is that Oda even tied Hancock's entire theme to snakes in the first place as the Snake Princess for a reason. But now setting aside the Mero Mero no Mi and looking at option 3, that the serpent is within the Red Line and needs to be broken out to begin its destruction of the world, well, if we go all the way back to the introduction of the Gura Gura no Mi, we were told something very specific about it, that this is a fruit that can destroy the world itself. Now this is an extremely bold statement, especially considering that by all accounts, as strong as the Gura Gura no Mi is, it is an absurd exaggeration to claim that it has the power to destroy the world. We've seen the Gura Gura no Mi in use countless times throughout the story at this point, and while it certainly has the potential to destroy islands, nothing really indicates that it can destroy the world itself. But what if its reputation for being able to destroy the world is because the Gura Gura no Mi is a key to unleashing the end of the world? Why? Because the Earthquake fruit is the one fruit that can break open the giant landmass, the Red Line, thereby freeing the snake that ends the world. Think about it, there is only one other fruit in One Piece that we are told will end the world, and that is Loki's fruit, the giant dragon. And the giant dragon's counterpart is the Great Serpent. Wouldn't it make sense if that's precisely why the Gura Gura no Mi is said to be able to destroy the world? Not because of the Gura Gura no Mi's power itself, but because it can release the other great world-ending monster, the giant serpent. No Note, I'm not saying that Sengoku here is aware of the Red Line Serpent when he says that the Guruguru no Mi can end the world. I'm saying that Sengoku is simply stating the reputation that the Guruguru no Mi has likely held over centuries from ancient times. It's likely been passed down since that era that the Guruguru no Mi has the potential to end the world. And if it sounds crazy that the Guruguru no Mi is going to cause such powerful earthquakes that it can unleash the Great Serpent, well, that is in fact precisely what we were told happened at the end of the First World. The phrasing of the Harley text here is very specific. At the end of the First World, the Earth God raged, and with its serpent of hellfire destroyed the world. The Earth God raged immediately brings to mind the idea of earthquakes. That type of calamity would be ascribed to an Earth God raging. And so in the First World, it sounds like a dual force is being described. The fury and destruction of the Earth alongside a great serpent. Could it be that the user of the Guruguru no Mi has always been tied to unleashing the Great Serpent? This is especially interesting when you consider that, again, in Skypiea, if we go all the way back to ancient times, long before Enel, the great evil force of the land in the past was the Serpent, and the Shandians associated the Serpent deity with earthquakes. It's stated over and over that earthquakes are tied to the Great Snake's rage. So Oda has always been foreshadowing the connection between earthquakes and the Great Snake. In the context of the broader One Piece world connecting the pieces we know of, the Harley specifically is talking about earthquakes coinciding with the fury of the Serpent of Hellfire. In the modern day, Blackbeard is the wielder of the Guruguru no Mi, which can supposedly somehow bring about the end of the world. We know that Blackbeard did not choose this fruit randomly. He specifically wanted the Guruguru no Mi, as it was a necessary piece to complete his overall plan. And lastly, we know that the Red Line either is or houses a great serpent that needs to be unleashed in the final war. So if we're putting everything together, it seems like the clearest answer is that the serpent is not the Red Line itself, rather it is within the Red Line. It can only be freed, much like in the First World, by the power of earthquakes. The Guruguru no Mi is the one fruit with the power to do so. That's why the Guruguru no Mi developed the fearsome reputation of holding the power to destroy the world, and that's also why Blackbeard specifically pursued the Guruguru no Mi, because he knew that with it, he could free the serpent and wreak havoc upon the celestial dragons. And the even bigger tip-off here is that if we read further into the First World's Harley text, the entire segment seems to scream Blackbeard. Blackbeard's two powers that represent him are earthquakes and darkness, and in the Harley it is stated that the Earth God raged, and along with the Serpent of Hellfire, shrouded the world in death and darkness. Earth God's rage shrouding the world in darkness. That is as literally as possible the encapsulation of Blackbeard's powers and what he represents. Blackbeard is the character that is set to unleash the Serpent today, just as it happened in ancient times. And this also lines up thematically with what Blackbeard is meant to represent in the final war, as well as why the Serpent would be naturally opposed to Imu rather than on Imu's side. So one of the most important overlooked aspects of the Harley text reveal is the why. See, before the Harley mural was revealed, the prevailing belief among readers was that the lore that we really needed to uncover was in the Void Century and what happened to the Ancient Kingdom. For the vast majority of readers, the fact that it turned out that there were actually two eras that we needed to learn about, the First World and the Second World, was a revelation. Because almost everything that we knew of so far, Imu, Joy Boy, the Ancient Kingdoms, the Ancient Weapons, the Void Century, all of that was the Second World conflict. So why then did Oda drop this bombshell on us that there was actually a very important period that we also needed to understand that actually came even earlier? And that's because One Piece from the beginning has always been about trying to fight two different types of evil: forces of authoritarian control and forces of destructive chaos. Now I've talked about this many times in past videos, but the point is that in some arcs, Oda shows us evil authoritarian figures that need to be torn down to free people from oppression, and in other arcs we are shown wild, destructive forces that need to be stopped from ruining a peaceful land. The various islands throughout One Piece are caught between these two types of evil. For instance, do nations choose to submit to the Celestial Dragons and serve the evil authoritarian power? Or do they reject the Celestial Dragons and then become overrun and have their societies destroyed by the forces of chaos? Pirates. Now, there are a lot of extra layers of nuance to this. After all, the world of evil pirates has largely arisen in response to the oppression of the Celestial Dragons, and a major point is that pirates today could become authoritarian rulers tomorrow, and that the roles swap throughout history, etc, etc. But keeping in mind that throughout the story, Oda has always tried to showcase both sides of evil, Now let us look again at what happened in the first world and the second world, and why it's important to tell us the story of both. See, the climax of both worlds are each meant to represent the two different types of evil in the story. The second world ends with evil authoritarian power, Emu taking over, symbolized by a great oppressive flood sinking the world as everyone comes under the power of a great evil oppressor. But if the second world ends with evil taking control, interestingly in the first world it sounds like it was the reverse. The first world ends with a great force of evil destroying everything. We are told that the earth shatters as a serpent of hellfire rampages, and the entire world is plunged into death and destruction. Pretty much exactly what Blackbeard says that he wants to do to the world. Why? Because the end of the first world is meant to show one type of evil that has been portrayed throughout the story, destructive evil, and the end of the second world is meant to show the second type of evil that has been portrayed throughout the story, oppressive evil. That's why we need to hear the story of both worlds. And most importantly, what is also illustrated in these two worlds is the idea of cycles. Since the first world started out with man as a slave, so there already was oppression. Oppression was combated by the release of a great destructive force. But the point is that the release of this force of destruction did not actually make the world better. Just as someone like Blackbeard succeeding would not make the world better. Rather, this destructive force seemingly liberated the world technically, but turned it into a hellscape in the process. Now we know the third world is the one that is supposed to end the cycle. This is the time that we should finally get the true dawn of the world, where the world is liberated, but by the right type of person who will pave the way to birth a better world rather than just bring about the apocalypse. So with all that perspective in mind, why then is the Serpent meant to be released in the final war? Because the final war has to thematically close out everything. We are not just going to be tackling the evil of Emu and the Celestial Dragons, because that is just an evil from the second world. We are also going to be tackling the evil from the first world, the great serpent that once destroyed everything, because symbolically both of these evils need to be conquered to properly show the way to the correct third path. And that is also precisely why Blackbeard will be the one to free the serpent, because the serpent and everything it represents, the destructive evil of the first world, is tied to what Blackbeard currently represents, and is of course directly opposed to what Emu and the Celestial Dragons represent. So how then will the battle against the serpent and Blackbeard play out? So to begin with, we know that Loki is set to fight the Serpent, as it fits both ways. Loki is the only character in One Piece who could even be large enough to contend with the Serpent, considering it's practically the size of the Red Line itself. And on the flip side, Loki himself is so strong that he is clearly too powerful for anyone in the final war to be his opponent, except for Emu and Blackbeard. So the giant Serpent of Hellfire is almost necessary to give Loki a fair one-on-one matchup. Thematically, this also lines up as Loki and Blackbeard have both pitched themselves as agents of destruction, and they're both also inspired by the same figure, rocks. As such, Loki and Blackbeard are destined to be at odds in some way, as they each represent a different side to Rox's influence. Loki actually is more in line with the type of man that Rox was, a wild anti-hero but with a good heart underneath, whereas Blackbeard is essentially a version of Rox devoid of any morals. Now the problem of course is that Loki cannot be the one to defeat Blackbeard, that simply has to go to Luffy, so for Loki to contend against Blackbeard in a meaningful symbolic way, Loki being the one to stop Blackbeard's main ploy, the Serpent, would be the next best thing. Now, all of this does seem to put Blackbeard in a potentially more passive role. If Emu is fighting the Alliance, and the other great evil is the Serpent that Blackbeard releases, what then is Blackbeard's own role? I now believe it becomes very likely that once the dust settles and Emu and the Serpent have both been defeated, then we will see Blackbeard swoop in and take his spot as the true final villain of the story, potentially even stealing Emu's fruit in the process. This would complete the idea of cycles, that one type of evil can become the other depending on if they are able to seize power. And it also sets us up perfectly for the conclusion of One Piece thematically, because in this manner, the final war will involve defeating both the Serpent, aka the destructive evil from the first world, and Emu, aka the authoritarian evil from the second world. And after these two defeats, we will get the final battle, a merging of the two concepts. Blackbeard, a destroyer who wants to rule over the world's ashes, essentially both a destructive evil and an authoritarian evil, the ultimate merging of the dual evils that One Piece has featured throughout the series, thereby making Blackbeard the perfect final villain of the third world to be defeated by Luffy, who of course in doing so will conclude the thematic conflict of One Piece and bring the dawn to a new, truly harmonious final world. So let me know in the comments below if you believe Blackbeard will unleash the world serpent, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear the complete breakdown of how Boa Hancock plays into all this, how the snake in Skypiea actually tells us even more about the final battle of One Piece, how Laboon fits in the picture, and how even Arlong Park gives us hints to the finale of One Piece, then you can listen to my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.